Hello, everyone. This is David Finkley, and today we're going to be talking about the genres of the Bible. Stay tuned. It's going to be an exciting podcast. Let's get started.
Welcome to the CAEA podcast. Get ready to study, read, and grow together.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Again, today we're going to be talking about the genres of the Bible. And this is very important because we need to understand how to appropriate our methodology of reading the Bible based on where we're reading in the Bible. The interesting thing about the Bible is that it's not just one big book. It is a collection of writings over such a large span of time. And what that means is that we have to accept the variety of styles that are presented in this text and this sacred book in order to understand the overall message. So there are a few genres that we're going to mention, and actually there are quite a few of them that are scattered all across the Old and New Testament. And hopefully by understanding and grasping these genres, one would be able to better interpret, or should I say, understand the writings that they will be reading throughout the year. If you haven't listened to the first podcast, I would invite you to go ahead and take a listen to that, because that's going to give you the fundamentals, the basics of reading the Bible. And this will just be a sort of a part two of those basics as we go through the different genres, all right? So the first one is history or narrative. So the history or narrative genre is going to include the books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, the Kings and the Chronicles, and even Ezra and Nehemiah, Esther, Jonah, and even the book of Acts and the New Testament. And the focus of these writings is to tell a story. It's trying to tell us how a sequence of events have transpired in real time. And the point of these writings are to relay this information in a way that will coincide with the other genres of writing that are present in the Bible, which we will cover. So literally within a narrative, you may have a sequence of events that are happening, but while these events are happening, other parts of the Bible are able to give details that will help us understand the narrative in a more complete way. And really, this is what makes up the entire Bible. That's why it's important to read a chronological reading plan, because while you're going through the narrative, which is included in these various books that I just named, you're able to pull in details from the other parts of the Bible that will make this whole story become alive and colorful and meaningful and sensible, really, as you read through the Bible, all right? So as you have the narrative, you can kind of think of it as the overall framework in which the story is told. And the other genres of writing, it is somewhat of the details. Some are minor, some are major, but they nonetheless are details in the overall narrative of the Bible, all right? The next genre of writing we have is the law. And these are generally found in the books of Moses, specifically in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Now, we do understand that laws are included in the books of Exodus and in some of the other books, but predominantly really in the book of Exodus. But if we were to understand the overall theme of the book of Exodus, we would understand it is a narrative style of writing. The laws are a bit different because they are not trying to tell a story. They are literally outlining laws that are to be accepted and embraced by the nation of Israel. So when you read through the book of Leviticus, it's literally giving you the Levitical laws and all the things that must be done in dietary conditions or situations, cleansing rituals. It's going to literally, for that purpose, give you laws, a sequence of laws. And then when we get to the book of Deuteronomy, it rehearses those laws that were once mentioned in previous books of the Bible, namely in the book of Leviticus. All right. So we do understand when we read the laws that are in the Bible, or the genre of law in the Bible, we are reading it as such. We are reading it as if it is a legal transcript of things that are to be done and not done. We're not necessarily looking to find a story out of it. We're just looking to see what are the regulations, what are the ordinances, what are the commandments. And if you want to get a glimpse of what that is like, you can read the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. It will give you a clear depiction of what the genre of law looks like in the Bible. All right. Next, we have the genre of wisdom. Okay. Now, wisdom is a very interesting genre because it is a type of writing that seeks to utilize proverbs and maxims and different parabolic statements and even information that can be considered not a real life event, but it seeks to portray a certain element of wisdom and truth. Okay. So even when we look at a narrative, or a book like the book of Job, we do understand that the book of Job has a rhetoric style of writing and argumentation that seeks to express a dialogue between two or a few friends, three friends, and Job, that is giving us an element of wisdom that wouldn't be expressed in the narrative style of writing. Take, for instance, the books of Plato, right? That is giving us these dialogues between Socrates and the different individuals that are going back and forth with him in each one of the books. We wouldn't necessarily read that as a narrative. We would read it as a sort of wisdom book because of the style in which the events are being told. So we can look at the book of Job in that same way. And also when we look at the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, we understand very clearly that those sayings were proverbial and that they were sayings that were collected from the experiences of Solomon and his interpretation of them. So we can see how that would differ from, say, the law genre or the narrative or history genre. All right. So moving along, we have also the poetry genre, which is a genre that is found most dominantly in the Psalms and the Song of Solomon, and then also in Lamentations. And these are poetic because they include rhymes and certain songs and certain rhythmic sayings to express a certain element of truth in a poetic way. And not only are these sorts of imagery, poetic styles found in the Psalms and Song of Solomon, but even within the prophets, they have a way of sometimes using this style of expressing truth. All right. Even though it's not a style of poetry, they use poetry or they speak poetically in order to portray certain truths. But speaking of prophecy or prophets, the next genre is prophecy. And I think this is something that we have to acknowledge, is that even within the books of Psalms, even though it is written with a poetic style, it does not mean that it's not a prophetic saying. Because even Jesus stated, as we mentioned in the last podcast, that he was mentioned in the Psalms. All right. So even the Psalms speak prophetically, even though it has a style that is unique and different from the prophetic writings. So when we think about the prophetic or the prophecy genre, that would include books like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, the prophets that we are very familiar with: Hosea, Joel, Zechariah, Amos, Obadiah, Malachi, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Nahum, and Micah. These prophets are categorized as a genre of prophecy simply because their entire book is made up of sayings that seek to prophesy about events that are to come. Okay. So they all have their different methods and ways of doing that. But we do understand that in prophecy and the books of prophecy, they are giving us information about events that are to come and soon will happen among the people they were talking about. Now, I want us to understand that this is a very important genre of of writing in the Bible. The prophets had several different ways of communicating their prophecies. And a lot of times it would be idiomatic. It would be filled with allegory, or should we say imagery, symbolism. And they would say it in a way that was comprehensible, or should we say easy to understand by the audience that they were talking to. They would use the common vernacular and sayings that were common to them. And one of the hardest things about reading prophetic writings is that as we read the writings in our time, we are a bit detached from these sayings that would have been familiar to the audience. That means that we really have to take the time to understand what these sayings would have meant to them, instead of trying to create our own meaning for them in our own time. That would be a huge mistake and a great exploitation of Scripture. It would be best for us to do the homework and just study the phrases, the terminology as best as possible, so we don't mistake anything that the prophets would have said in their own time. Okay, so that's very important. I can't express that enough. All right, so let's go to the next one. The next one is apocalyptic. All right, so the imagery, even though Daniel is a prophetic writing, the imagery and the way in which prophecy is given in the book of Daniel will categorize it to fit within also the apocalyptic genre. We do find that also the book of Revelation is apocalyptic as well, because these narratives seek to give us the sort of imagery that is a fusion of imagery and poetic phrases. Okay. And really what it does is these two books in particular, they give us a understanding of the end of things that are relevant to the book itself. And what we mean by that, a lot of times whenever we talk about apocalyptic imagery or apocalyptic writings, we assume it means the end of the world, but really it just means the end. It's a description and very poetic. And I mean, it is very poetic and filled with all sorts of imagery. A reading through the book of Revelation cannot be done correctly without referring to the imagery that is borrowed from Old Testament texts. And that's what makes it apocalyptic in style for the most part, because it is using such heavy imagery and poetic phrases that one cannot understand it unless they were to go back and understand the poetry and the imagery from which the book of Revelation borrowed the phraseology and the terminology. But I will just say this in passing on the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is intended to be a book to reveal Jesus Christ. And that is the sole purpose of the book, and that is for good reasoning. But at the same time, I just want to mention, as it pertains to the style of writing that is present, that one has to understand that the book of Revelation must be read within the apocalyptic genre that it was written in. If that does not happen, of course, there'll be sharp, very sharp discussions of disagreement as we so have it in our time. All right, let's move on to the next one. The next one is parabolic or parables, which are found mostly in the gospel. Jesus was a parabolic teacher. He taught by parables, and he sought to express truth by using stories and narratives of things that didn't necessarily happen, but he used the story to present a truth. These stories were instructional, or should we say didactic in nature, because Jesus was trying to instruct the disciples by painting a colorful picture that they would have been able to relate to. And the study of the parables of Jesus is actually a very interesting one, because a lot of times he uses parables to tell such deep truths that were so relative to the things that were happening in the world of the first century. And just by understanding the parables of Jesus, we're able to get a glimpse into the world of the first century. So that is a very important way. And we have to understand that we wouldn't interpret parables as real events. These events that were mentioned in the parables didn't necessarily happen as it would have in a narrative genre. But Jesus was using these stories that he would create or he would build as he was teaching to express a point that was either relevant to the hearer or an example of the sort of experience that they may have had in their own time. So that's very important to identify and to mark as we're reading through the teachings of Jesus Christ. All right. The next genre would be the epistle. It is a letter. All right. These letters were written by Paul, James, Peter, and some of the first century letters that were recaptured. It shows that they were very, very everyday letters, nothing theologically deep about them. It was used to simply respond or write to a particular group of people who had an interest in the things that were being relayed. Now, an example of these letters are, of course, the book of Romans, the letters to the Corinthians, the letter to Galatians, the saints in Galatia and Ephesus, or should we say the letter to the Ephesians, the Philippians, Colossians, and it goes on and on. It is interesting, however, if we look at the first 3 chapters of the book of Revelation, we will find that it is written in an epistolatory way. All right. It is a sort of an epistle because what it is doing in the first 3 chapters is speaking directly to the 7 churches in the way that a writer would speak to anyone who is writing a letter. It is when we get into the 4th chapter that the apocalyptic writing becomes very heavy and the apocalyptic genre becomes very evident. But the first 3 chapters could be understood as a sort of an epistle seeking to express truth to people who would have been concerned about events and endeavors, all right, that were going on in their own time. So we understand this style of writing to be an address to circumstances that were real in their lives and things that they would have had questions on. And we would read it like we would read a letter that was written to us here, only by first understanding the context and the parameters in which that letter would have been written. Okay, that's the most important thing. I think out of all of this, the most important thing is for us to understand there's a context to everything, okay? And to ignore that would put us at a disadvantage. So as we go and consider in our reading these genres of writing, it'd be good to have a notebook or just write this in your Bible somewhere, put a sticky note there so that when you go throughout these writings, you can remind yourself, okay, and when I go into the Psalms, I'm reading poetry, okay? When I go into the Proverbs, I'm reading wisdom literature. When I go into Deuteronomy and Leviticus, I'm reading law. When I read into Revelation, I'm reading apocalyptic writing. These are the kind of steps you have to take in order to successfully read the Bible and apply a system, right? Apply systematic reading so that the Bible can be consistent throughout. Your reading of the Bible can be consistent and you won't have any distortion of the actual message. All right. So brothers and sisters, I thank you for listening. I hope this has been helpful for you. Until next time, we're going to continue the study. We're going to continue to encourage each other. And I hope that you have already committed to reading the Bible with us in the year 2020. If not, please go ahead to www.ca-ea.org. Download our Bible plan. Please follow us on all of our social media web platforms. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. All of our handles are follow CAEA. You should be able to find us on all those platforms. All right. Until next time, thank you for listening. God bless.